Hello everyone and welcome to another video with me, 320 Sim Pilot. Today we are taking a big step for the channel. We're beginning our Boeing 787 tutorial series in Microsoft Flight Simulator. In the real world, I am an airline pilot and I have been flying the Airbus A320 up until very recently, when I have now swapped over onto the Boeing 787. So that is what my license now allows me to fly, the Boeing 787. And strangely enough, I'm also type rated, which is what we called it when you're trained on one of these aircraft. I'm also type rated on the Boeing 777, the 777, which is, there are reasons for that, which we will discuss later. But I am a Boeing 787 pilot now in the real world. As a result, I thought it would be good to bring my tutorials to the Boeing 787 and give you a bit of in-depth knowledge on how we operate this aircraft in the real world. And of course, as ever, this is not for any real world use, it's just to give you some extra context on your home simulations. I'm going to be using the default or the included Boeing 787-10, which comes with Microsoft Flight Simulator Premium Edition. Now, you can, of course, get this or upgrade to this version if you don't have it, and that's the aircraft I'll be using for this series, as there's no high detail payware 787s out yet for any of the simulators really, although there are some in progress. But this one is, I think, very good since the last update to it a few months ago. I think the Microsoft default 787-10 is probably one of the better, if not the best, default aircraft out there. It's really very good, and I'm very impressed with what they've done with it, and it gives us a chance to show off a lot of the features of the 787. Now, the 787-10 that we're using is a really unique aircraft, and all of the 787 family is. It's a aircraft that has so many different features to conventional contemporary aircraft, such as the Boeing 777, the A330, the A330neo, the A350 even. And the 787 is also unique in the sense that it has some systems and design features that we aren't even seeing in more modern aircraft. So like I say, the 350 and even the Boeing 777X, the 777-9, the new one that's not even in service yet, doesn't have all of the systems the 787 has in terms of how advanced some of them are. And we're going to be looking at those throughout this series as we go through learning this aircraft. I will also be live streaming, so do make sure you subscribe if you'd like to join in on those, where I'll answer questions live. But the idea of this series is to give you some of that extra context on your home simulations and to give you an idea of what this aircraft's like in the real world to live with and operate on. As is traditional for my tutorials, I'm going to start with this video today, which is a bit of an introduction, and also we'll do a walk around of the outside of the aircraft. Every flight, the pilots, or one of the pilots, will have to do a walk around on the aircraft where we walk around the outside and perform an exterior inspection of the machine. This is a bit of a catch-all for anything that might have been left undone or anything that could suddenly have started leaking in between when it was last inspected by an engineer. The ground crew will also inspect the aircraft before it's pushed back, so there are lots and lots of opportunities for anything that needs to be corrected to be found. But what we'll do today is just go for that walk around, and I can take you through the exterior of the aircraft and just show you what some of the little bits are and some of the differences of the 787. This is a default aircraft, so the exterior model is not 100% accurate, but it's a pretty good representation. It certainly looks very much like a 787 in terms of shape, and captures the style of it, even if it doesn't have all the tiny little details glued onto the outside, which of course there are many. So for those of you unfamiliar with the Boeing 787 family, this is the 787-10, the longest variant. It's also the newest variant of the 787 that Boeing only released a couple of years ago. There is also the 787-9, slightly shorter, and the 787-8, even shorter than that, and the original aircraft, which is quite short for a long-haul aircraft. This 787-10 is a big machine. It is 68.3 meters long at its longest point, 60.1 meter wingspan, which is actually the same for all of them, and is 17 meters tall, also the same for all of them. It is literally just stretched, an elongated aircraft. It essentially sits around the Boeing 777-200 in terms of number of passengers. The fuselage is slightly narrower than the 777. So in economy, you can only fit 9 passengers across 3 seats, compared to, of course, the 777, which can now fit 10 if you really squeeze them in. That is not so relevant for the business class and premium cabins, of course, which are more spaced out and tend to just be 4 abreast these days. The 10 is a revised version, so it has lots of new updates over the 787-8 and 9, which do make it quite an interesting machine in its own right. But we'll be looking in a more generic sense at the Boeing 787 as we go through these videos. The Boeing 787-10 has a maximum takeoff weight of around about 250 tons. That's, funnily enough, about the same as the 787-9. The reason is, as you can see, it actually has the same number of wheels. It's quite a big aircraft to have the same main landing gear setup, but we'll talk about that a bit later on. But yeah, around 250 tons. For context, my A320, the A320 middle-sized aircraft, had a takeoff weight of around about 70, 75 tons. The A321 around 90 tons. And of course the A319 a bit less than that. But yeah, so this is a significantly heavier aircraft in many ways, despite the fact it's made of such modern materials. Right, let's get into the video and we'll go for a look around the outside and look at some of the differences on the Boeing 787. Now, normally before you start the walk around, you'd have done an initial setup in the flight deck, which we'll look at in the next video. But for the sake of this video, all I've done is connected the ground power. I have not turned on the battery or anything. So on the flight deck, if we jump up there, if you want to replicate this, all I've done so far is put the external power on. I've left everything else off. This is part of the flow that you would do on the flight deck, but we'll talk about that in the next video. The reason I've done that is so that we have the nav lights on. So I've also turned those on over here, which enables us to check that we have the red, green and white tail light showing when we do the walk around. You don't actually need nav lights when you're flying around in daylight, but on a long-haul aircraft, it's quite common to fly the aircraft through the night. Even if you start in the day, you might fly through the night and then back out in the day on the other side. So yeah, it's something that you would want to check. Also, you want to make sure the weather radar's off. Now that's visible in a little blue mark. So when you press WXR up here, it appears on the navigation display and on the mini-map below the PFD. You see this little WX. So you want to make sure that is off before you begin your walk around. Otherwise, you've got the radar radiating outside and it will be reflecting off these walls, and yeah, we don't really want that. But like I say, the full procedure on that coming next time. So you're outside by the door and we can see ourselves that the aircraft is, as I say, not much taller than the Airbus family in terms of its height off the ground. It is, however, a bigger fuselage, so it's really, really chunky. It's a big machine. It just sits very low on the ground. An advantage of that is that, of course, your landing gear is smaller. You don't need it to be as heavy because it's not as long, so therefore you can save weight. And this aircraft is all about efficiency. It's here to be more efficient than the previous generation in every way. So yeah, that's where we would begin. And you can first start off by looking down the side here, and we have these static ports. There's 3, they're spaced out quite far, and then there's another 3 on the other side. The air data system on the 787 is, of course, as we would expect, different to most airliners. These static ports all feed into one system that then chooses what it thinks is the correct sort of data. That's something we'll come to later, but it's not such a direct system as this is the captain's, this is the standby, this is the FO. What we actually have is a whole system where it's taking all of these inputs and then comparing them and deciding what's sensible, and it can actually identify as a result unreliable airspeed sort of data on its own. It's really very impressive. Again, a step up from previous generation aircraft. Then we have here, they've modeled quite nicely, the positive pressure relief valves. So if the pressure in the cabin on the aircraft gets too high, then it can actually, these will open and allow the air out. And that's to stop any stress damage to the fuselage if the pressure inside is too high. Because obviously this cabin pressurizes as we climb. Now, there is also a forward outflow valve over here, which is not modeled. That is where the air is let out, and that valve is controlled by the pressurization system to make sure that the cabin altitude stays at a sensible altitude. Interestingly enough, on the 787, it pressurizes to a lower cabin altitude than previous aircraft. So it's about 6,000 feet on average. Even if you're up at 43,000 feet, it can do that. 10 actually can't go that high. 10 goes to 41,000 feet. But yeah, it's a outflow valve just like a normal aircraft, the one at the front, one at the back, but you have these backup positive pressure valves. Now there are further back, they're not modeled on this version, but there are negative pressure valves. So they are there in case the fuselage does not repressurize and you descend, and then you have positive pressure outside, now squeezing the airframe in the wrong way. So they would then open and allow the air into the cabin to relieve the pressure in that way. As we move further forwards, you can see, by the way, big windows. They slightly change your perception of the size of the aircraft. They make it look a bit smaller, I think, than it is, because they are really quite big, really, really fantastic. So they run all along the side, obviously, and they can occasionally have a little rubber seal around the outside that has a performance penalty if that's missing. But so you do look for any obvious damage on those, and there's our door one left. Not usually used on a long-haul aircraft, unlike short-haul. Typically boarding is done through doors 2 back here, and that way you have a left turn for the premium cabin, as we all know, and a right turn usually for the more economy cabins. But having said that, not always. As we move forward, we get to the usual aircraft system. So up here we have pitot tubes and angle of attack sensors and temperature sensors. Not all modeled correctly. There should be a angle of attack tube up here. Angle of attack sensor up here. I think they put it as an ice detector here. It does get very close to a jetty if it's attached to the forward door. So it's another reason to use doors 2, further away from all the sensitive parts of the aircraft. You've also got your pitot system. So there's 3 pitos and 2 angle of attack sensors on the 787. You've got your air temperature sensors, and you've also got your ice detection. As we move forward around the nose gear, we have to have a look here, of course, usual sort of thing, tires. We check for inflation, wear, don't want to see any big chunks missing out of them or anything like that could become a problem at high speed. The 787 has a very swept wing, and it takes off at very high speeds, especially with high takeoff weights in hot areas, so easily over 200 miles an hour. I've seen 787s rotate in the 170 plus knots region, which is very fast. Again, for context, the A320 I was previously flying would often rotate in the 130, 140 knot region. So it's a fast machine. So yeah, we want these tires in good shape. The nose gear extension here, this is slightly overextended. It wouldn't typically look like that unless it was loaded up tail first. But yeah, that's what it's there for. Also for context, probably the camera, if I put it about here, that would be about head height. You can't quite, if you're reasonably tall, if you're over 6 foot, walking underneath it, you have to do a little bit of a duck. But there you go, just to show you how low it actually sits, because that's not something I would have expected when I first converted onto it. Here we have a little control panel. This can be used by ground crew to plug in their headset to talk to the flight deck. We can also see that there's the fire extinguisher buttons if you need to put out the fire with the APU, and there's a horn and a few other service bits here. So that's what this box is for on the rear of the nose gear. On the front, we have the hydraulic pistons for nose gear steering, and we have some lights. There's 2 sets of lights here. They don't turn with the nose gear. The only airplane I've flown that has that is the Dash 8 Q400, but they do just always point forward. And what you've got is, if we can get around to them, we've got takeoff lights and taxi lights. So the taxi lights will be on obviously for taxi, and the takeoff light is typically only actually used for landing. It's not a takeoff light, and that's what it was on the Airbus. Yeah, there's a landing light on the nose gear, but it's only really used for landing. But we have the taxi lights as well. Good. The nose gear bay you can also check, and we would also check that there's not a pin that stops the gear retracting, because there is a lockout pin that can go up there. Right, moving around, composite radome. So they've really captured, this is a really good shape. They've really captured the shape of the 787. The radome on the 787 is composite, but of course the whole aircraft is. So most aircraft have a composite radome, which is this dome at the very front that goes over the radar. The reason it's not metal is because that would reflect the radar, so it wouldn't be able to shine through it. So most aircraft, this is composite. However, the Dreamliner, of course, the whole airplane is made of composite. So what's the difference? Well, it's lighter. It's also very strong, and it allows more humidity in the cabin. So that's why the 787 is made of it. It's strong and it's light. So it's an advanced material to be using, but it allows the aircraft to be more efficient. That takeoff weight of 250 tons for an aircraft of this size is actually very good, and that's what enables it to be so efficient when it's flying along, and a reason airlines like it. Downsides of composite would be that it's harder to work with. It's not a very common material in airliners. At least it wasn't 10 years ago when this aircraft was brought into service. So repairing it can be slightly tricky, and it's susceptible to different sort of damage, such as delamination and so on. So very careful inspection schedules, and I think the knowledge and the material has obviously grown a lot over the previous sort of decade or so. One strange effect is, and you can actually see on the nose gear, we have these sort of lightning strips, these static lines to take lightning away, to take the electricity away and flow it in certain channels around the aeroplane. So if lightning does strike the 787, unlike a metal aircraft where you'll typically get an entrance point and an exit point, so there'll be maybe 2 small holes, if lightning strikes the 787, you end up with a series of tiny holes in the fuselage, which don't affect the aircraft at all, or the pressurization, but they do just form in a long sort of line. It's quite strange, and not something I'd expected. As we move up, we can see that the windscreen wipers on the 787 are in the up position, which is actually their default position for the Dreamliner. Makes it very, very quiet on the flight deck. It's really, really great. I absolutely love this. Yeah, so just vertical, stowed away, more efficient, less noise. Windscreen wipers are one of the leading cause of noise in a lot of aircraft. You'll notice on the Q400, a turboprop I used to fly, the windscreen wipers are supposed to be stowed across, but a lot of operators actually took to stowing them up because there was a slight fuel advantage and it was quieter on the flight deck. So win-win. However, not quite how it was designed. These are very good wipers stowed vertically. As we move up, something you can't see on your walk around, but what we'll talk about while we're here, is you've got the emergency escape hatch for the pilots. The windows do not open. The Dreamliner has beautiful big windows, really nice view from the flight deck. They go very low down, but that's something we'll see later on. However, they don't open. You can't open it and have a nice breeze on a nice summer's day, which is unfortunate. So if you need to get out in an emergency and you can't use the normal route, then you would go out of this escape hatch. This thing here is not a pitot or a probe or anything. It is purely so that you can actually get yourself over to the other side. So if there's a problem on this side, let's say there's some obstruction on this side and you can't escape down that way, then you would use that handle, pull yourself over and then escape round the other side. So that's all that is, and it sits there the entire time. To show you how quiet the noise is on the flight deck, I have heard aircraft go above me in the cruise. If they pass 1,000 feet above, you can actually hear the engine noise of the other aircraft. It's quite amazing. Moving around the other side, we get a repeat then of the temperature sensors, angle of attack sensors, and so on. Of course, another door. And here's a bit of a difference. This is the ground power unit entrance point. So it takes 2 ground power units through this forward point. The A320 only could use 1 AC ground power. This aircraft can take 3 total, but we only use 2 normally through this front port. There is a third port at the back used in certain situations, which we'll talk about another time. Forward cargo hold with the cargo handling control panel up here. Pretty self-explanatory, and then they've got a light here that shines down so they can see what they're doing in the dark. Here's our remaining static ports, the other side of that system, and like I say, back here somewhere we would have the negative pressure relief valves. Here's our wing inspection light, and now onto another unique part of this aircraft, which is the air system. The Boeing 787 does not use the traditional air system for pressurizing, and it's one of its best features, I would argue. Now, you'll probably hear me talk about this a lot as we go through the videos, but the 787's pressurization air does not come from the engines. On a normal aircraft, air is taken from the engine where it is compressed by the engine as part of its normal process of producing thrust. So the air is squeezed and squeezed, then it's ignited with fuel, and then that compresses it even more in a sense, and it flows out the back of the engine, spinning the turbines, which then spin the fans on the front, creating this cycle. Now, that air, before it's ignited, is squeezed and squeezed and squeezed, and then it's sent by some aircraft. They tap it off a little bit. You can just bleed off a bit of that air because you've got so much pressure in there. So it's very hot because you've squeezed it, and air gets hotter as you squeeze it. So it's then taken away, taken into the aircraft, sent through air conditioning packs where it's cooled down, and then sent into the cabin as pressurized air. Now, there are some downsides to this. That air tends to have come from the compressor stages, which can occasionally be subject to different sort of contaminants such as oil and things like that in the bleed system. Other problems would be that the aircraft's engines obviously want to use that compressed air for thrust. So by taking it away from the engines, you're actually reducing the efficiency of the engine, and it's sort of a necessary evil, as it were. In the same way that engines are also used for hydraulic power and electrical power, that also reduces their efficiency. Bleed air is quite a bad one. It was common on the Airbus to actually turning off the air conditioning packs. That way you stop taking away some of that bleed air during the takeoff process. Saves a bit more fuel. So the 787 got around that. We'll have the engines operate super efficiently, thank you very much, by not tapping off the air for pressurization, and we'll do it with a different system, and that's what we've got here. Now, what we have is, this is the inlet for the cabin air compressors, or CACs, CACs. There's 4 on the 787, 2 per side, and then what they do is they effectively act like a compressor in the engine, but they are their own separate system. So they squeeze the air, they suck it in, squeeze the air, and then it can be used straight away as if it had come from the engine, as if it was bleed air. So that squeezed air is then sent just the same way to an air conditioning pack, a separate system, and that is where it is cooled down and sent into the cabin. So this is where the air goes in. So air that goes in through this little door then goes into the cabin air compressor where it's squeezed, and then it's sent into the air conditioning pack further back here. The air conditioning pack uses this door. This is the ram air door for the packs. This air goes in, it then goes over the air conditioning pack, and it's used to cool the air that we've taken from the cabin air compressors. It's used to cool the air, and then this air is actually vented overboard again. So that's why you've got these two separate systems. On a normal aircraft, you wouldn't have this at all. You would just have the pack inlet. And the Airbus had it in a very similar position on the fuselage. So that's what we've got there. Really great system. It allows several advantages, which we'll see at other times. Now, up here, we have the runway turn-off lights. We have the landing and the remaining landing lights as well. So those are fitted into the wing root. They don't fold away. They don't hide like they do on the Airbus. They are always just here like this. So pretty neat. You can use them in the cruise if you want. It doesn't cause any rumble, doesn't cause any drag. It does make you wonder why the A320 has such over-engineered landing lights that have to fold out. But there we go. As we come down the fuselage, very clean wing. There is not much to describe on the wing. Now, this is obviously a little bit of a simplified texture here. It would be nice to have a bit more detail, but there's not a lot going on. The 787 wing is clean, very, very clean. And then we have the main landing gear, which we'll look at from the other side. Now we move on to the engines. This aircraft in Microsoft Flight Simulator has been modeled with the Trent Rolls-Royce 1000 engines, which you can see from the shape of them. I believe at least that's what they've gone for. So again, really similar to the A320neo engine. Engines have reached a very recognizable format. I really don't know how to describe much else about it. You do the usual things. You're looking underneath for any leaks. You're looking for all the panel hatches to be closed properly, all these sort of inspection panels, oil top-up panels, and so on. As you move around the front, you don't want to see any dents or anything like that. And what we've got in the intake of this engine is, again, really, really similar to the Airbus Neo engine. Big fan, high bypass ratio. So what I mean by that is the core of the engine in there is where the actual air goes in and gets compressed and ignited and sent out the back. And all of this stuff around the side is just cold air that goes through this fan. Big, and that's called bypass air. So you want a big bypass ratio these days is what they go for efficiency, and this aircraft is very efficient. This probe up here, which is nice to see modeled, is the TPR probe. So this being a Rolls-Royce engine, they don't measure the thrust, or the primary engine instrument is not the N1 speed, which is this fan. It's called the N1 fan, and the speed at which it turns is often used as the thrust setting reference for these aircraft. Rolls-Royce used something called, they used to use EPR, now it uses TPR using this little sensor here. So it senses the pressure at the intake of the engine, and then there's another sensor on the back of the engine, the thrust coming out the back. So it knows exactly how much thrust is being generated compared to comparing the front pressure and the back pressure. So it's quite a clever system, if a little bit convoluted in terms of using it day to day. Very sensitive system, so it can be quite hard to read, I find, as a pilot. More drain masks and so on, which we have to make sure nothing unusual leaking from. This dent here is really interesting. This is correct. This is on the newer engines. What they have now, they've actually smoothed it over. On the older aircraft, there used to be a vent here, but that's no longer there. So yeah, quite interesting to see that modelled properly. They've also gone for this serrated edge to the back of the engine, which is designed to reduce the noise of the engine. It reduces the way the air hits still air around it, which is what the roar of these engines makes. That's where the noise comes from, that mixing of the two different air speeds. Moving along, we have the slats, making sure they're all retracted and in good shape, and these are the little slat track covers, which is absolutely fine. That's spot on for how they are. All the way out, and it's a long way out to the wingtips on this aircraft. They are big wings, especially if you think of the size of the aircraft. They're actually pretty similar to the 777's wings. We've got our nav light here, so our green nav light, and then this is our strobe light. Fancy LED versions. 787, very recognizable by its lights, because at night the strobe lights are, or the anti-collision lights as they're called, they flash in a sort of steady pulse. So they come on for a second, off, on, off. Whereas most other aircraft, they just flash, an instant flash every few seconds. So you can see a Dreamliner from hundreds of miles away in the air at night, because it's got really bright and really different sort of strobing pattern. Out here we have all the statics and so on, and you can see we don't have a sharklet, as it were, which is became common on aircraft. We have a sort of a raked wing, it's called. So this part of the wing doesn't produce lift. It's used to stop the wingtip vortices from swirling over the wing and it reduces the amount of drag produced by the wing, therefore increases the efficiency of the aircraft. The downside is it's quite long because it sticks out flat. Now, Boeing go with this for these long-range aircraft. It makes sense, whereas we can see with their short-range aircraft, the 737 MAX, they have a more vertical style of winglet, like you have on the A320 Sharklet and the A320neo. But for long-range airplanes like this, they have gone for this flatter sort of wing. As I say, downside is it gets in the way. So Boeing did originally have a plan for a shortened version of the 787, not a shortened version, a shorter wing version, which could be used in airports that would not be able to fit this larger wing. So it was going to be a vertical style of Sharklet for shorter sort of routes. However, they did not do that in the end due to difficulties with the production. But yeah, there we go. That's what we have. So there's no aileron out there. It looks like it should be out on that edge bit, but it's not. That's just sort of, I don't want to call it dead wing, but yeah, it is not used for much. This is our outboard aileron. We get 2 ailerons on the 787. So one out here. Then we have the fuel dumping or fuel jettison system. Hopefully not needed, but that's where it is. And then our flaps. Very simple, single slotted flaps on the 787. Unlike the 777, where the inboard part is more complex, they've kept them quite small. They are, again, designed to be light. Here we have the inboard aileron. So this is used a lot during the cruise once you get to higher speed. The reason is you don't want to be using this outboard aileron at high speed because all you're going to do is just bend the wing around. 787 has very bendy wings, again, composite wings, and it's great for turbulence, great for efficiency, but they do bend up a lot in flight. And if you were using this outboard aileron, it would just sort of have a negative effect of sort of twisting the wing around. So at high speed, this inboard one is used mainly. So also the aircraft systems can use all these controls to bring the aircraft into the best position for landing and takeoff. It can also use them to counteract turbulence. Very effective turbulence counteraction system. And you'll see these, if you're ever on a 787 in flight with turbulence and you look out at the wing, you'll see these things all moving around, sorting out the turbulence. It's very, very clever. They'll move together and against each other and all sorts. An interesting thing about the 787 as well is even the flaps might adjust in the cruise, not as part of the pilot's instructions, but as part of the aircraft's efficiency, setting up the wing just how it wants to be for that phase of flight. Really impressive stuff. Now to the exhaust of our Trent 1000 engines, and as you can see, here's that high bypass ratio. This is the core of the engine, the hot air, and this is all the cold air coming around the fan. Again, remarkably similar. It struck me a lot when I first did my walk around on it, how similar it looks to an A320neo engine. Really, that technology is in a very similar place, which would make sense. Remember, the 787 is a slightly older aircraft now. It's been in service for 10 plus years, so but it's still up there, leading the pack, I would say, in lots of ways. Onto the main landing gear now, and as you can see, it still only has 4 gear per each truck, so 8 total main gear and then 2 nose gears, which is quite unusual for an aircraft of this size. The Boeing 777-200, which is a bit smaller than this, has, or about similar sort of size, I suppose, that runs with 6 gear on each of these main bogies. So yeah, it's a relatively small set of landing gear. Obviously, it's beefed up on the 10 version compared to the 8 and 9, but otherwise essentially the same. Obviously, as with the Airbus family, as you move between different variants, different sizes, they'll be set to different pressures and regulations to make sure that the weights all work. One thing that you do get on the 10, which is missing in this visual model, is there's actually an additional sort of hydraulic strut fitted to the main gears. Now, it's not something that we're told much about as pilots, but it is fitted to it. What it does is it's used by the 787-10 variant to actually help get the aircraft into the air. It's really quite remarkable, but as you can see here, it is actually missing. What that is it should be, there's a hydraulic sort of addition that runs from here up to here on the main gear, but this is sort of the more standard gear. As you can see, it's got lots of cabling, and normally we're checking, of course, for a few things, one of which is the brake pins, the wear pins. We want to make sure that these stick through slightly, otherwise the brakes have run out. As the brakes wear, they move down. Pretty standard sort of carbon ceramic brakes, or carbon brakes that you get on commercial airliners. I'm not sure if they're ceramic, but yeah, the brake system, however, is again very different. These are electronic brakes. These cables are not supplying hydraulic fluid, they're supplying electricity to the braking system. This is a particular advantage to the 787 in the event of any sort of failure, in that you can actually lose all 3 hydraulic systems and still stop the aircraft in a surprisingly short distance, because it can still use the full capability of its wheel brakes I really like these electric brakes. They're also incredibly responsive and incredibly consistent for us as pilots because of the way they're done electrically. I don't know exactly what the tolerances are of hydraulic systems. It feels the same aircraft to aircraft. Really like that. But like I say, just from this visual model, they're just missing that additional extra bit. So what happens is the 10 is too long to rotate properly off the ground. So what happens is the main gear actually lifts the airplane up slightly. As you get to rotate speed, they push down and push the airplane up into the air a bit, and then you have tail clearance to rotate the aircraft properly. But there we go, looking for tyre tread, brake wear, that sort of thing, any leaks around the main gear. But like I say, no hydraulics, or not much hydraulics going on down there, so we're not expecting to see any fluids or leaks like that. Moving along on the fuselage then, pretty simple visual model from here. The aircraft's pretty clean. There's a few vent holes and so on, and antennas, rear cargo hold here, and another panel and another light. Then there should be an aft outflow valve. That's also not modelled, just as it's not at the front, and the rear door. Then we get up to the tail of the aircraft. You've got to make extra attention to look up at this because it's quite a long way above your head by this point. A unique feature of the 787 tail is it does have static ports on it. So the static ports are called static because they refer to the static air pressure. That's the air pressure sat here, the ambient air pressure as it were. The pitos measure dynamic pressure, or the pressure on the front of the aircraft, but statics measure the ambient pressure. On the tail of the aircraft, there are static ports on each side. This way, during takeoff or any sort of gust that would evoke a turning force on the tail, so a gust of wind striking the tail on one side, then the static ports sense this because they can feel that change in pressure. There'll be higher pressure on one side, lower on the other. Now that would cause the airplane to rotate, to try and turn into wind like a weather vane. But what these static ports allow the aircraft to do is apply counteracting rudder straight away to make sure that that doesn't happen. So actually gusts that cause any sort of rotation of the aircraft are dampened out by the airplane systems. Not entirely, you still have to put some input, but they are damped out. Now those static ports are a long way up and quite hard to see actually, but we are checking to make sure they're not damaged or anything obvious going on there. As you move around the tail, and this is a nice little detail, you see how modern the design of the 787 is. Look at this swoop on the inboard of the elevator. Really nice. It's a very fancy looking airplane as you walk around it. It looks very aerodynamic, very clean, and this is just one of those examples. Round at the tail we have the APU. The APU inlet is on top of the fuselage, but here it is with this little exhaust sort of vane. I'm not sure entirely why that's there, but that is on there on all of the models of 787. It's quite normal. And then we have the APU exhaust. Not the loudest APU in the world. Again, the APU doesn't need to use any bleed air. The APU feeds electricity only. We just use it for electricity on the 787. Very capable APU. It can provide a lot of electricity to the aircraft. It has two big generators attached to it, as well as the engines, which both have two really big generators as well. So yeah, that's a difference in the design to not have any bleed system. As a result, the APU on the 787 is very fuel efficient. It doesn't get through much fuel, even if you're using it to provide air conditioning. On the Airbus aircraft, if you were on the ground for a while using the APU for air conditioning, you would soon get through some of your fuel, but very little on the 787. These are the rear strobe lights, which you can see, left and right to the tail, quite iconic part of the design. And the actual navigation rear light is put on the wingtips, quite common for Boeing. So these are the rear nav lights, these are the anti-collision strobe lights. As we move down the other side of the fuselage then, I won't take you all through it again, but you do a repeat of what we've just done, checking out all the different bits of the 787's fancy, as I say, systems. Often these inboard ailerons will be drooped down, or any of the controls will droop down. They are hydraulic after all. Most of the flight controls are hydraulic. Flaps, hydraulic gear are hydraulic, but it does have some electronic controls around, such as the electronic stabilizer. So that is electronically controlled. Again, more advantages if you have a triple hydraulic failure. But this aircraft does have 3 hydraulic systems, each one capable of flying it, and even if they all fail, it can still fly, which I think is an amazing piece of engineering. It's a very, very capable airplane indeed. Then you walk all the way back over to your engine, and as I say, repeat what we saw on the start. So that's pretty much it for today's video. Like I say, just a bit of an introduction, and we can start talking about some of the differences of the 787 and see what's on the outside of it. So now we have an idea of what's going on as we fly it around, hopefully. By the way, these along the leading edge are accurate. These are vortex generators. quite common on Boeing aircraft. I haven't seen them on many Airbus aircraft, but they're used to energize the airflow slightly over the top of the wing, which enables it to stay stuck to the top surface for longer, reduces the separation. So yeah, interesting to see those even on this 787. Right, that's all then. So thank you so much for watching the video. Please do stay tuned for more videos, live streams and guides coming on the 787, as well as other aircraft in Microsoft Flight Simulator. I saw a few people were questioning whether we'd see the Airbus again. We will of course have the Airbus on the channel as well. I'm not going to be able to go completely without it. So the Airbus will feature as and when we get the videos and streams in. But thank you so much for sticking with us. Thank you for watching this video, and there'll be more guides, including the cold and dark setup of the 787, all coming in the future. Thank you very much for watching. Bye bye.